The sun spilled gold over the harbor, painting the water in shimmering streaks that clung to the hulls of yachts lined up like palaces on the sea. Music carried across the waves, soft jazz from one vessel, heavy bass from another, the sounds colliding and blending into the hum of wealth and indulgence. Glasses clinked, laughter rippled, and the air reeked of perfume and champagne. In the middle of it all, on a yacht that looked more serviceable than spectacular, Elena stood near the railing. She was 30, her beauty the sort that didn't demand attention but stayed with you once noticed clean, unpainted skin glowing in the afternoon light, hazel eyes calm, hair tied back in a simple knot that left her face exposed. She wore a plain sundress, soft fabric that shifted with the breeze. Nothing glittering, nothing costly. Around her shoulders was a light shawl, faded at the edges, and beneath it, pinned close to her heart, was a small medal. The silver had dulled with time, its surface scratched, but it caught the sun just enough to flash when she shifted. Most saw it as nothing, a trinket. Few knew what it meant. The neighboring yachts gleamed like floating mansions, their polished chrome rails reflecting sunlight like mirrors. Guests wore white suits, silk dresses, diamonds that sparked like fire when the light struck. They clutched crystal flutes of champagne, their laughter swelling in waves that rolled across the water. Their eyes flicked toward Elena, then away, then back again, their expressions curling with amusement. Who even invited her? One man whispered loudly enough to be heard, his tone mocking as he adjusted his cufflinks. Probably borrowed that boat, a woman replied, her sequined dress dazzling in the sun. She tilted her head toward Elena, her smile sharp as a knife. Just look at her, not a drop of class, a freeloader. Pretender, another voice added, low but biting. Their laughter rolled across the waves, feeding one another, loud enough that Elena had no choice but to hear. Still, she didn't flinch. Her hand rested lightly on the railing, her shoulders straight, her expression calm. When the breeze lifted her shawl, her fingers brushed the metal pinned beneath it, the movement small and unremarkable, but deliberate. The metal brought with it a flicker of memory, salt spray against her face, the roar of a storm that made the sea itself feel alive and cruel. A vessel overturned, its belly to the sky, wood splintering as the waves tossed it like a toy. She remembered dragging herself through freezing water, lungs burning, arms screaming with pain as she clung to another's body, a man, half conscious, his weight more than she could bear. Helicopter blades thundered overhead. A voice crackled through static radios, but all she could think was, one more pull, just one more. The smell of burning fuel filled her nose. The sea stung with salt and blood, and she remembered hands slipping from hers only for her to grip harder, teeth clenched, refusing to let go. She hadn't thought of glory then, or recognition. She thought of faces, families, the possibility of saving at least one life in the chaos. The memory dissolved as quickly as it came, replaced by the sound of another burst of laughter from the neighboring yacht. A young woman in pearls lifted her phone, angling it slyly toward Elena. "This is too good," she murmured to her friend. "She looks like she wandered off a ferry and pretended she belonged." Her friend giggled, already imagining the cruel captions that would accompany the picture online. Elena's eyes shifted, scanning the horizon. The sea stretched endless and glittering, its vastness a comfort. She breathed slowly, the noise around her fading into the background, like static on a radio she'd long since learned to ignore. Her hand lingered on the metal beneath her shawl, the weight of it steady against her heart. They didn't know. None of them knew. To them, she was nothing but a woman in plain clothes out of place among sequins and gold. She stood silently, not to hide, not to endure, but because she had already carried storms far heavier than their whispers. The afternoon sun slid lower across the water, gilding the waves in copper light and deepening every shadow cast across the clustered yachts. From one boat to another, voices carried easily, carried eagerly, the kind of words meant to wound but disguised in laughter. Elena stood quietly at the rail of her modest yacht, her hand light against the worn wood, her posture calm though every sound was sharp as glass. A sleek businessman on a yacht draped in flags leaned back in his chair, a cigarette balanced carelessly between his fingers. His suit was cut too perfectly, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and he smirked toward Elena without bothering to lower his voice. "She probably rented that boat for a day," he said, drawing chuckles from his companions. He lifted his chin, eyes scanning her with disdain. "Just look at her. Doesn't belong here." The remark rippled outward, picked up by others who had been watching her with idle curiosity. A glamorous woman in a gown the color of champagne leaned against the railing of a larger vessel, her diamonds winking like stars as she turned her head toward Elena. Her lips curled into a sneer, each word delivered to be overheard. "Real women of the sea wear pearls, not thrift, store cotton." Her companions laughed, their glasses raised in approval. Phones began to appear, small screens lifted like weapons. A young man in aviators aimed his camera, snapping quick shots of Elena, as though she were some oddity on display. "Yacht imposter," he muttered with a grin, already typing the caption as his friends crowded around to see. Another woman tilted her phone, the light catching her jeweled bracelet, and murmured to her date, "Seawater Cinderella, wait until this goes online." They giggled, delighted by their cruelty, eager to trap her image in pixels and spread it beyond the dock. Through it all, Elena did not move. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, where the water stretched open and endless, unbothered by the noise of people who thought themselves powerful. Her fingers brushed the railing, steady, unshaken, though the swell of laughter rolled around her like waves intent on pulling her under. A quiet shuffle of feet drew close. The deckhand, barely more than a boy, his uniform sleeves rolled up and his face sunburnt from long hours under the sky, paused near where she stood. His eyes, quick and uncertain, lingered on the metal that glinted faintly beneath her shawl. Recognition flickered across his features, something solemn softening the nervous lines of his face. He gave the smallest of nods, respectful, almost reverent. For a moment, their gazes met just long enough for her to see he understood. Then he moved on, carrying a coiled rope across his shoulder, swallowed again by the laughter of the wealthy who never noticed him. The brief acknowledgement was gone as quickly as it came, drowned beneath a tide of scorn that only grew louder. Elena's breath was even, her lips pressed together not in anger but in resolve. The horizon gleamed gold before her, vast and certain, and she fixed her eyes upon it. The jeers, the whispers, the raised phones, they were only weather, a passing storm. She had stood against worse, braced against gales that tore sails to ribbons and waves that sought to swallow whole crews. Her hand tightened slightly on the railing, not as if she needed to hold on, but as though she were anchoring herself, steadying against the judgment crashing around her. They did not know who she was. They did not know what she had carried through storms. To them, she was just a simple woman, a shadow among diamonds and silk. But the sea, stretching vast before her, remembered, and so did she. The sun had begun its slow descent, turning the water into a sheet of copper and gold when the air changed. The laughter that had been flowing so easily from deck to deck faltered, caught by something low and steady, a sound that did not belong to champagne glasses and idle gossip. A deep rumble rolled across the harbor, vibrating through the hulls of every yacht. Heads turned, conversations broke, and eyes narrowed toward the horizon where a thick mist clung stubbornly to the sea. Out of that veil of gray, a shape emerged. At first, it seemed like a shadow, too immense to be real, but as the mist parted, steel took form. A warship, massive and unyielding, cut across the water with the inevitability of a mountain moving through the sea. Its hull, gray and scarred with the history of storms and salt, dwarfed the glittering yachts around it. The sound of its engines rolled like thunder, sending waves outward that made smaller boats pitch and shudder, glasses sliding across polished decks, heels clattering as guests scrambled for balance. "Why is a destroyer here?" A man in a white linen suit muttered, his voice sharp with nerves. His companion clutched his arm, her diamonds winking as her hand trembled. "What's going on?" another whispered, fumbling with his phone, as though capturing the moment might give him control over it. Phones rose across the flotilla. Dozens of screens pointed toward the advancing giant, the glow of them flickering like desperate lanterns. Guests murmured in a mix of confusion and unease, their earlier confidence drowned beneath the looming presence of steel and power. Elena did not move. She stood as she had stood all evening, one hand steady on the railing, her eyes fixed now on the warship cutting its way toward her. The laughter that had mocked her moments before was gone, swallowed by the thrum of engines and the whistle of the breeze. The warship slowed as it drew alongside the line of yachts, but it did not align with the largest or most dazzling of them. It shifted deliberately, its bulk looming until its shadow fell across the modest vessel where Elena stood. The water churned and slapped against her boat's hull, the force of its presence undeniable. Then came the whistle, sharp and piercing, echoing off steel and water. Officers' voices barked commands that carried across the waves, crisp and unwavering. In perfect unison, hundreds of sailors snapped to attention, their boots striking the deck like a single heartbeat. They raised their hands in salute, not to the crowd of glittering gowns and tailored suits staring from the safety of their yachts, not to the businessmen clutching their champagne flutes or the women adorned in pearls and diamonds. Every eye, every salute, every breath of solemnity was fixed on Elena. Gasps rippled through the luxury crowd. A man near the bow of a sleek yacht stumbled backward, his glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the deck. A woman in sequins pressed a hand to her chest, her face drained of color as if the sight had pulled the very air from her lungs. Another guest, caught mid-laugh, choked on his own voice, the sound collapsing into silence. The harbor, once a theater of mockery and indulgence, now belonged to the warship and to the woman who stood alone on the modest boat. Elena did not raise her hand, not yet. She simply stood in the shadow of steel, the metal beneath her shawl glinting faintly as if the warship itself recognized it. The scorn that had drowned her minutes earlier had been swept away in an instant, replaced by disbelief, awe, and a dawning fear in the faces of those who had thought her nothing. The deck of the warship shifted as a figure stepped forward, the gleam of his polished shoes and the weight of his presence commanding every eye. His uniform was immaculate, medals lining his chest, but his face bore the lines of salt and storms, a man not unfamiliar with hardship. He planted his boots firmly at the edge of the steel deck, lifted a hand to quiet his men, and then his voice rolled out across the water like a drumbeat, carrying through the mist, bouncing from hull to hull. "This," he said, his voice booming, steady, undeniable, "is the woman who saved half our crew when our chopper went down in the Gulf. We owe her our lives." The words struck the harbor like a cannon. Silence fell in an instant, crashing heavy and absolute over the yachts that only moments ago had bubbled with laughter and ridicule, the glasses stilled in hands. Phones that had been lifted high now faltered, lowered slowly, screens dimming in shame. The men and women who had mocked, whispered, pointed, who had built their cruelty on her simplicity, stared with wide eyes, as if the very air had been stolen from their lungs. A woman in a sequin gown who had whispered "Seawater Cinderella" with such delight, pressed her lips tight, her hand trembling around her glass. The businessman who had declared she'd rented the yacht shifted uncomfortably, his face pale as if the light had turned too harsh upon him. Their laughter, their clever remarks, all seemed fragile now, broken toys scattered in the wake of truth. Elena did not move. She did not smile. Her shoulders were steady, her gaze calm, her silence louder than their shame. The metal beneath her shawl caught the glow of the setting sun, and she brushed it lightly with her fingers once more, not as a display but as a quiet acknowledgement to herself, to the memory it held. Her voice rose then, low but steady, carrying across the water, cutting through the stunned hush with a clarity that left no space for doubt. "I didn't do it for recognition," she said. "I did it so they'd see their families again." The words were simple, but they carried weight heavier than gold. The air itself seemed to hold still, pressing her truth into every listening ear. On the warship, an officer barked a sharp order, and a moment later a flare streaked skyward, bursting into light above the bay. Thunder rolled from its echo, rattling the masts and hulls, sending ripples of sound deep into the harbor. The blast was ceremonial, but it felt like judgment, like a line drawn between the shallow world of glittering yachts and the deeper truth of sacrifice. The sailors held their salute, unwavering, their eyes fixed not on wealth or status but on the woman whose courage had once pulled them from death. Gasps broke among the crowd, some guests stumbling as if the ground itself had shifted beneath them. A man whispered, "My God," and no one contradicted him. Elena remained as she had all along, still and steady, her presence unadorned yet commanding. In that moment, she was no longer the woman overlooked, dismissed, or mocked. She was the anchor of the harbor, the one the sea itself seemed to honor. The simple woman was invisible no longer. She was saluted, not because of the clothes she wore, not because of any glitter or shine, but because she had once reached into chaos and pulled life back from the jaws of loss. And nothing, not wealth, not mockery, not the shallow gaze of those who judged, could take that away.